course, insists that the U.S. must not deal with Hamas. They committed a crime too. They won a democratic election, and that's not privileged. In fact, as soon as the only free election in the Arab world, really, Palestine, January 2006, they won the election. They weren't supposed to. So instantly, the U.S. initiated a policy to punish the Palestinians for voting the wrong way. Not the first time. And this went on right alongside the rhetoric about our love for democracy, Bush's democracy agenda, and so on and so forth. The U.S. and Israel, of course, initiated a program to punish the Palestinians, a serious program. For example, the U.S. blocked the European Union effort to send medical supplies and pencils and things to Gaza because maybe they'd be used by Hamas. Who knows? It's kind of like the Israeli prohibitions today. They don't allow macaroni and toilet paper in because you could make bombs with them. So that even elicited a brief comment from Hillary Clinton. But it continues to support them. So we can't deal with them. And of course, as always, there's a pretext. The pretext is that Hamas doesn't accept three conditions that we impose. One, they have to recognize Israel. Two, they have to renounce violence. And three, they have to accept previous agreements, particularly the famous roadmap. I mean, the fact that he can say that, anybody can say that, without the press corps collapsing in ridicule, is pretty impressive. Does the U.S. accept those three conditions? Does Israel accept it? Have the U.S. and Israel renounced violence? Do they recognize Palestine? Did they live up to past agreements, like, say, the roadmap? In fact, Israel immediately announced, when the roadmap appeared, that it wasn't going to accept it. The way they did it is by saying, yeah, we accept it, it's wonderful, we have 14 reservations, which completely eviscerated. I think one of the merits of Jimmy Carter's book is that for the first time he broke the silence on that. I noticed that no reviewer ever mentioned it, but that was the one novel contribution within the mainstream in his book. He actually had an appendix in which he gave the 14 reservations, which the U.S. approved of, which ends that agreement. And of course, Kerry says free settlement, that's another one. So that's how we're going to solve the Israel-Palestine problem. Namely, shift it to, put it to the side, continue our blocking of a political settlement. Yeah. Mornings here. And I should mention in this connection, I'll go on to the last thing, that the political settlement is accepted by the entire world. I mean, Europe, the non-aligned countries, Hamas accepted it for years, Hezbollah, Iran has said they accepted it. Just the U.S. and Israel blocking it again, constantly. Obama, the same. Kerry, the same. The media can't talk about it, or maybe don't know. More work to be done. Well, what about Iran? Kerry also talked about Iran. He said, we can't take force off the table. Of course, we want to negotiate, we're friendly and so on, but one of the options is force. It seems to bother nobody that the threat of force is explicitly in violation of the foundations of international law, violation of the UN Charter, which bars the threat or use of force in international affairs. But we're above the law, so that doesn't matter. Obama, too. Obama is supposed to have reached out his hand in friendship to Iran a couple of days ago with his New Year's message. What did he say, actually? He said, well, we're going to be happy to talk to you, but you have to meet some responsibilities. You have to give up arms and violence. And again, how can anybody hear that and not collapse in ridicule? I mean, Iran has to give up arms and violence. Whose military budget equals that of the rest of the world combined? It's not Iran. Who carries out aggression regularly, in fact, right on the borders of Iran? In fact, when was Iran last guilty of the use of violence? it doesn't matter. It passes. More work for us to do. Joe Biden, the vice president, amplified this. He said that we'll be willing to deal with Iran if it accepts our conditions in advance of negotiations, namely stop its uranium enrichment. He said it must stop its illicit nuclear programs. Why? And of course, end terror. What are its illicit nuclear programs? Well, I mean, there was certainly uranium enrichment is not illicit. In fact, that's the height of any signer of the non-proliferation treaty. So it must be that they have a weapons program. Well, there was a national intelligence estimate in November 2007, which concluded after long deliberation that they don't have a weapons program and haven't had it for years. Obama responded to that. He said, yes, that was what intelligence decided. We reject it. He also said, we don't have any new evidence. His administration said, we don't have any new evidence, we don't like it, so reject it. So therefore, whatever they're doing is illicit. As far as terror is concerned, ugly regime, no doubt there's plenty of terror, but what the U.S. is pointing to is their efforts alleged efforts, probably true, to assist Hezbollah and Hamas to defend themselves against a U.S.-Israeli attack. That's terror in our lexicon. Nobody's allowed to defend themselves against our force or the force of our clients. So that's terror, again, accepted. What does the world think about this? Well, what you read is that constantly is that the international community has demanded that Iran stop uranium enrichment. Who exactly is the international community? Well, what about the majority of states in the world, which are an online movement? Well, they forcefully, insistently support Iran's right to enrich uranium as a signer of the non-proliferation treaty. So they're not part of the international community. What about the American population? A large majority of them agree with an online movement. Probably 75% say, sure, Iran has this right. So the American population is not part of the international community. In fact, what the international community is, and this is the way the term is almost always used, is Washington and whoever happens to agree with it at that moment. So, yeah, they demand that Iran stop any kind of uranium enrichment because we say, though our intelligence estimate says the opposite, that they're doing it for weapons production. The American opinion here, and this is kind of important for activists, is quite interesting in other respects. I mean, a large majority of Americans, like 75-80%, think the United States ought to live up to the non-proliferation treaty. Yeah. That means eliminate its nuclear weapons. And a corresponding majority, roughly 75-80%, advocate a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That means Iran, Israel, and any U.S. forces deployed there. Okay, whatever problem there may be could be mitigated and probably overcome by moves in that direction. But that's not an electoral option. It's only the public that wants that. Well, I got 20 minutes, so I'll stop. All of this, without elaborating, gives plenty of work for activists who want to become engaged in these issues. There's a lot to say about domestic and financial issues, but I think Bill's going to talk about that, so I'll stop.